Midnight in the palace is not supposed to feel like this. The air was heavy, almost crushing, as if the walls themselves were listening. At the far end of the silent corridor, 3 generals moved in perfect step towards Brahim Traoré's private office. Their uniforms gleamed under the dim golden lights, their boots striking the marble floor like a slow drumbeat of fate. One of them was hiding a secret that could end everything. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next is something that history will remember with unease. Inside the office, Traoré sat behind his broad wooden desk, a single lamp casting shadows across the room. Papers lay scattered before him, but his eyes were fixed on the door. He could feel a shift in the air long before the sound of approaching footsteps reached him. Years of living in a world where trust could turn to betrayal and a heartbeat had sharpened his instincts. Tonight, those instincts told him something was about to break. The door handle turned slowly, without a knock. The first general entered, his expression unreadable. The second followed, carrying a folder under his arm, his face tense but controlled. The third came last, his gaze not meeting Traoré's eyes, as if avoiding a truth too heavy to carry openly. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Traoré leaned back in his chair, studying them. "You all chose to come at this hour," he said, his voice low, almost testing. "I assume this is not a social visit." The general with the folder stepped forward and placed it on the desk. "So," he began, his voice steady but cold, "there are matters that cannot wait until morning." The third general shifted uneasily, his hand brushing the inside of his coat. Traoré noticed. His gaze lingered just long enough for the man to sense it. For a brief second, something flickered in the general's eyes. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. The folder was opened, revealing documents that made Traoré's jaw tighten. "These are not just reports," he said quietly. "These are accusations." His voice carried no anger, only the weight of a man who had seen betrayal before, but never expected it to come from so close. Outside, in the courtyard, a vehicle engine started. It was a sound so ordinary that most would ignore it. But tonight, every sound felt loaded with meaning. Inside the room, 3 generals stood in the soft glow of the lamp, and only one knew that before dawn, loyalty would be tested in a way that would leave scars far deeper than any wound on the battlefield. The ticking of the clock grew louder, as if it were marking the countdown to something none of them wished to name. Traoré kept his hands on the desk, fingers unmoving, his eyes shifting from one face to the other. He knew better than to ask direct questions. In his world, truth was rarely given freely. It was taken. The first general spoke, his voice carrying a tone of restrained urgency. "So, the accusations in these documents are not just about policy. They suggest actions that could be seen as treason." His words landed heavily, and the air in the room seemed to tighten. Traoré did not answer immediately. He allowed the weight of the statement to settle. "Finally," he said, "and you believe I am the one accused?" His voice was calm, but his gaze locked sharply on the third general, the one who had avoided his eyes since entering. The third general shifted again, his polished boots scraping lightly against the floor. "We came here together, as brothers in arms," he said, his voice low. "But not all of us see the same future for this country." It was a strange choice of words, almost poetic, yet it carried the bite of a challenge. Traoré leaned forward, the light from the lamp cutting across his face. "Then speak plainly. Whose future do you serve?" The man said nothing. His silence was an answer in itself, and it was a kind that told Traoré the betrayal had already begun long before tonight. The second general cleared his throat and tried to pull the moment back from the edge. "So, there are forces outside these walls, forces that believe a change in leadership is necessary. They have allies, and they are waiting for a signal." "A signal from inside?" Traoré asked. His voice was almost a whisper, but the question carried the weight of suspicion that pressed against the walls. The second general did not look away. "Yes, from someone you trust." Outside, the vehicle engine roared once more, and the sound faded into the night. It was not leaving, it was repositioning. Traoré's mind calculated distances, exits, and the number of guards posted in the courtyard. Every detail mattered. Then, in the stillness, the third general finally spoke. "If you step aside now, you can leave with dignity. If not, the choice will be made for you." The words fell like cold steel on stone. The other two generals turned to look at him, as if his open declaration had crossed a line that none dared approach before. Traoré stood, his shadow stretching long across the room. His voice was measured, but it carried the force of unshaken authority. Then perhaps the night will decide whose dignity survives the dawn. No one moved. The night outside held its breath. Somewhere in the darkness, a plan was already in motion. The silence between them was no longer just awkward. It was dangerous. The faint hum of the palace's old ventilation system filled the space where words should have been. Each man knew that the next sentence could set the night ablaze. Traoré stepped out from behind his desk, his boots making slow, deliberate sounds on the floor. His presence filled the room in a way that had nothing to do with size. It was the quiet authority of someone who had walked through fire and returned with the scars to prove it. He stood before the third general, the one whose words had carried the weight of betrayal moments ago. "You have served beside me through storms and fire," Traoré said, his voice steady. "Tell me now, have you already chosen another master?" The general's lips tightened, but before he could answer, a muffled sound echoed from the courtyard, metal clanging, followed by footsteps. The second general's head turned slightly, just enough for Traoré to catch it. That single movement told him everything. Whatever was planned for this night was already happening outside these walls. Traoré glanced at the first general. "You brought them here, did you not?" It was not an accusation, more like a test. The first general straightened his shoulders. "I brought them here to protect you," he said firmly. "But I did not expect this." His eyes shifted to the third general, and a subtle tension flared between them, like dry leaves catching the first spark of fire. Outside, the sound of boots grew louder. Orders were being shouted in low, urgent voices. The courtyard was filling with movement, though no one inside the room could yet see it. The third general finally broke the stillness. "The country is on the edge, Brahim, and men like you, men who cannot be controlled, they do not last long. If you do not step aside, the blood will be on your hands." Traoré's eyes darkened, but he did not raise his voice. "I have carried blood on my hands before, but never because I betrayed my people. Can you say the same?" A brief flicker of uncertainty crossed the general's face, but it was gone almost as soon as it appeared. He stepped back, as though making room for something or someone about to enter. Then the door burst open. Two soldiers stepped in, rifles in hand, their eyes fixed on Traoré. Behind them, shadows moved in the hallway, suggesting more were waiting just beyond sight. The first general reached instinctively for his sidearm, but the second general placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Not here," he murmured, though his own eyes betrayed the fear of a man caught between loyalty and survival. Traoré did not move. His gaze swept across the room, reading every face, weighing every heartbeat. Somewhere within this tense triangle of loyalty, fear, and ambition lay the truth, and he intended to drag it into the light before the night was over. The rifles remained pointed, their black barrels like cold eyes fixed on one man. The soldiers waited for an order, but from whom? That question lingered in the air, thick as smoke. Traoré stood motionless, yet every nerve in his body was calculating the distance to the nearest guard, the odds of reaching the window, the time it would take for backup to arrive. The third general took one slow step forward, positioning himself between Traoré and the soldiers. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but the words were razor-sharp. "You have led long enough. The country demands stability, and you have become the storm." Traoré's eyes narrowed. "If stability means chains, then I would rather be the storm." His tone was measured, but the defiance in it was unshakable. The first general shifted closer to Traoré, his hand once again near his weapon. "Sir," he whispered, "say the word." But Traoré did not. Instead, he looked at the second general, the man who had spoken least but watched most. "You have not said where you stand," Traoré said, his voice echoing slightly in the tense room. The second general's gaze was unreadable. "Where I stand depends on who is still standing when this night ends." It was a dangerous answer, one that revealed nothing and everything at the same time. From outside, the sound of boots striking stone drew nearer. The shadow of another soldier crossed the open doorway. The third general raised a hand, signaling them to wait. He turned back to Traoré with a final offer. Step aside now, and you will leave alive. Refuse, and the men outside will not hesitate. Traoré allowed a moment of silence, letting the weight of the choice settle over every man in the room. Then he stepped closer to the third general until only inches separated them. His voice dropped low, meant only for the betrayer's ears. You believe you have surrounded me, but you have mistaken the center of the circle. Before the third general could react, a sharp knock echoed from the far side of the room. Not the main door, but the concealed panel behind Traoré's desk. The soldiers flinched, their aim wavering for just a second. The panel swung open, revealing two of Traoré's own guards, armed and ready. They moved in silently, positioning themselves with calculated precision. The soldiers who had entered earlier glanced at each other, their confidence faltering. The third general's jaw tightened. You think this changes the outcome? It already has, Traoré replied, his eyes locked on him. Because now the question is not whether I will leave this room alive, but whether you will. The air thickened with a silence so heavy it felt like the walls might crack. Every man in that room understood that the next breath could trigger the first shot, and once it began, there would be no turning back. No one moved. The soldiers' fingers tightened on their triggers, yet their eyes darted between the two opposing forces now facing each other. The night outside was a muffled storm of movement, boots, and murmured orders, but here in this dimly lit room, the air was so still it felt like time had paused. Traoré's guards stood at his side, their rifles held steady. The first general slowly slid his hand to his sidearm, ready to draw if the moment shattered. The second general remained near the doorway, his stance balanced, his loyalty unreadable. The third general exhaled slowly, as though he had made his choice. "This can end without blood," he said, his voice steady but stripped of warmth. "All you have to do is accept that your time is over." Traoré took a step forward, the lamplight catching the sharp lines of his face. "If I leave now, it will not stop the blood," he replied. "It will only open the door for more. Men like you do not want peace. You want control." The word seemed to strike something in the third general. His jaw clenched, and for the first time, anger cracked through his disciplined mask. Control is the only thing keeping this nation from tearing itself apart. Before Traoré could respond, a sudden crash came from the hallway. Shouts, a scuffle, the unmistakable sound of a rifle clattering to the floor. One of the soldiers by the door spun around, distracted, and that single heartbeat of hesitation was enough. The first general drew his sidearm and stepped forward. The two soldiers in front of Traoré swung their rifles towards him, but Traoré's own guards moved in fast, weapons raised, voices low and firm. No shots were fired, but the tension was seconds from shattering. The second general stepped between them all, raising both hands. "Stop," he barked. His voice was sharp enough to freeze the movement for a moment. If one shot is fired, no one in this room will walk out alive. The third general's eyes locked on him. "Then choose a side. Now!" The second general's gaze flicked between Traoré and the betrayer. His chest rose and fell slowly, his expression still impossible to read. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted closer to Traoré. It was enough to make the third general's face harden. He stepped back towards the hallway and gave a sharp whistle. Footsteps thundered from outside as more men approached. Traoré's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "You are calling reinforcements into my house. But the difference between us, General, is that I know every corner, every exit, every shadow. Do you?" The third general's confidence faltered just enough for Traoré to see it. And in that flicker of doubt, a new calculation began, one that would decide who commanded the next dawn. The thunder of boots outside grew louder, a drumbeat that shook the marble floor beneath them. Shadows lengthened in the doorway as more soldiers arrived, their silhouettes sharp against the dim light of the corridor. The air inside the office was thick with unspoken threats, the weight of history pressing in on every man present. Traoré did not move from his place. His eyes locked on the third general, the betrayer who had brought the storm to his door. "You came here with power in your pocket," he said quietly, "but you forgot that power means nothing without the ground to stand on." The third general gave a small nod to the soldiers outside. 3 of them stepped forward into the office, rifles at the ready. But they hesitated when they saw Traoré's guards holding their aim steady, their faces showing no sign of fear. The first general moved closer to Traoré. his voice low. "Sir, we can take them now. Just give the signal." Traoré did not answer immediately. He studied the soldiers in front of him, young men, loyal not to a cause but to the last order given to them. Their eyes shifted, uncertain. The silence stretched until it became its own kind of pressure. Finally, Traoré spoke, not to his guards, not to the generals, but to the soldiers themselves. "Every man in this room will have to live with the choice he makes tonight. You can choose to point your rifle at your leader, or you can choose to point it at the man who sold your country's future for his own gain." The words hit harder than any bullet. One of the soldiers faltered, lowering his weapon slightly. Another followed, his grip loosening. The third glanced at the third general, then at Traoré, and took a step back. The third general's face darkened. "Do not listen to him. This is the only way to save the country." Traoré's voice rose, sharp and clear. "No, this is the way you save yourself. But I will not step aside, not for a coward who hides his ambition behind the word stability." The tension broke in a sudden shift. The soldiers turned fully away from Traoré, their rifles now angled towards the betrayer. The room seemed to shrink around the third general, his allies now nothing more than shadows receding from his side. The second general finally spoke, his tone cold and decisive. "It is over." For a moment, the third general looked as if he might fight, but the weight of the room had turned against him. His shoulders sank, and he let his weapon drop to the floor. Traoré stepped forward until he stood just inches away. "You came here thinking you could take the night from me," he said. "But you forgot. Midnight belongs to the one who still stands when the sun returns." Outside, the first light of dawn touched the horizon. Inside, the night's betrayal ended, not with a roar of gunfire, but with a quiet full of man who had lost everything.